Well, we're really pleased now to be joined by Ash Sarkar, who has written a very wonderful book called Minority Rule, Adventures in the Culture War. Ash, sum it up.
Oh my God. It was a contractual obligation, so I had to write it.
You had to write
No. It was... Okay, so in summary, this is a book about why is it in an era of widening wealth inequality that class consciousness seems to be in decline, and other forms of political subjectivity, namely what you might call identity politics, has largely replaced it. And of course, identity politics is normally associated just with, the left and with progressives. But what I argue in the book is that it's also a feature of the right, the fact that they've managed to become the party of, the so-called white working class. I think that indicates to me that something has happened to class identity. It's been turned into more of an ethnic identity. And where the book ends up is that, it goes through a journey of talking about the left, talking about the media, talking about politics. And then it ends up with trying to describe what's happened to the economy really after the financial crisis. This move to what, some like Brett Christophers call, a rentier model. I call it a landlord model, just to make it simpler for people who don't know French. And there are others like Jody Dean and Yanis Varoufakis who argue that we're actually moving towards something which resembles feudalism more than it does sort of traditional free market capitalism. And I think the reason why that's important is that if you believe, like I do, that conditions shape consciousness, that the economic forces at play in a society change how we think, change how we live, change our politics, then I think that this, slide towards global landlordism, that is why we feel so disempowered.
That's a brilliant summary, Ash. Thank you. And it I think it gives some flavour of a really wide-ranging book. Now, this is a media podcast, so we're especially interested in the media angle. What part do you think media in this country has played in the picture you're describing?
I mean, absolutely huge. And I think one of the first things that was really central for me in thinking about this book and putting together the proposal was realizing how much politics has collapsed into media. So politicians are indistinguishable from pundits in many ways. They're little more than talking heads coming up with sound bites, come up with the right line that can shift the polls a couple of points either way. And also that we consume so much media. We spend so much of our time interacting with the world via screens, and yet trust in media is in an absolute free fall. So I think that's doing something quite interesting psychologically. And my argument is that the media has relentlessly focused on identity-driven conflict. I talk about the focus on micro events where what has happened is in inverse proportion to the amount of coverage it generates. Very few people actually impacted, lots and lots of chatter. But that also, the media has played this role in... am I allowed to swear on this podcast? Sorry, I probably should have asked this before.
We swear all the time.
Thank God for that. My mum doesn't like it, but it's an essential part of my vocabulary. An awful lot of political journalism, to put it bluntly, is bullshit artists inflating the stock of other bullshit artists. And I think that's how you get this cycle of Theresa May, bestriding the world like a colossus. Oh no, she lost her majority. Boris Johnson, this big electoral bruiser. Oh no, he's venal and self-serving. Rishi Sunak, eat out to help out. He's the guy who really knows his numbers. Oh no, he's a damp squib. And I think that we're at that part of the story with Keir Starmer as well, which is that there is this curious relationship between lobby journalists in particular, the political correspondents in Westminster, and politicians, where they don't notice things when it's convenient not to notice them, and then when it's politically convenient to notice that, Keir Starmer ran a deceptive campaign and he's got no ideas, then it's safe to say these things which were common knowledge.
In terms of the culture wars, what we'd now call the culture wars, which I don't know how old that phrase is. Maybe it's 10 years in common usage. But there was a period when I began to notice that some titles, what am I thinking of? The Mail, but actually perhaps more so than Mail on Sunday, and then everybody was writing about things that we could call culture wars. And I must admit, I was quite skeptical about it to begin with. I thought, who actually is interested in these subjects? But I think you're arguing that actually they did become mainstream subjects.
And I think part of it is social media. I mean, the way I think about, my smartphone is that it's a mirror to the self and it's with me all the time. And it's algorithmically creating a feed of information which is telling me something about myself and encouraging me to think of other people in ways which are very binary. Either you're my follower and you're on my side, or you're a threat to me. You're in competition with me. You're someone who's having a go at me. And that, I think, has really fed into culture wars, this, endless adversariality. But I think the central thing about culture war and why I phrase it in the singular rather than the plural is because actually I think it's like 1,000 doors opening out onto the same place, because it's the same story again and again. Here's this hectoring minority who's, hijacked your eyeballs, they're commanding your attention, and they're telling you how to think, how to live, how to behave. And there's an illegitimacy to that. And I think that all of these news stories, whether it's about trans people and pronouns, or, BLM and the N-word on faulty towers, or even something like Just Stop Oil, it's always the same narrative, the same emotional story being told.
Just talk a bit about transgender wars, because that seems like when you talk about very few people are impacted, objectively, there are not many people who are transgender compared with, the general population. And yet it seems to have assumed a huge significance both here and in America. And we've seen newspapers, news organizations riven by being unable to work out how to handle this subject.
Yes, I believe there's a newspaper called The Guardian.
I was
struggled a lot internally with the coverage of trans issues.
But not just The Guardian, yeah.
Not just The Guardian, but I think that The Guardian is really important for understanding why it's had the shape that it has in the UK. Because in the United States, the attack on trans rights is coming from the conservative right, people who are very closely linked to the evangelical Christian movement. And there is a strong Republican element to it. That's not the case here. And in fact, you may remember that the proposed amendments to the Gender Recognition Act, that was a Theresa May policy. It was in the Conservative manifesto. We've moved a really long way away from that. And I don't want to shut down what I think are legitimate discussions about what's the threshold for socially and legally accepting someone into their chosen gender, right? That is an entirely legitimate argument. But the way in which it's been playing out, I think the media has conducted itself appallingly. When you've got Kay Burley asking politicians, can a woman have a penis, which is quite frankly the most vulgar and prurient way into the discussion possible, it's made it a lot more polarizing. And what I found in researching the book is that many of these framings, which are kind of holding up trans women's bodies up as a sort of object of horror and disgust, is that there was a conveyor belt, and it came from trans hostile activists, moved through social media, and then it's in the mouths of some of the most prominent and highly paid journalists in the country.
I think there are many valuable insights in this book, Minority Rule, and I like the title. But I want to go back to your premise. You quite rightly said sort of politics had collapsed in media. You look at the current opposition leader, Kemi Badenoch. Hardly anything on policy comes out. It's all soundbite. But leaving that aside, who's driving this? Is it really the media, or is the media actually just reacting to individuals who now have a voice through smartphones and mass audience, or indeed politicians?
Well, I think it's it's like a mad dance where, now leading, now following, and it's dynamic. But you have individuals like Piers Morgan who are creatures of legacy media, trained in newspapers, moves to broadcast media. Now his platform is online only. And I think he's understood that social media changes the game for broadcast media. It has to behave a little bit more like social media. And that also, where traditional broadcast media channels are really competing for viewers and ad revenues are falling through the floor, there's something to be gained from social media virality. So I think that distinction between legacy media and social media is blurring a lot, particularly in the last couple of years. I think in terms of how media organizations are reacting is that, media organizations are made up of people who are having to respond to the incentives of the finances of media. That's true. But also people who are deeply politically motivated. Many of the politics editors, the editors in chief, the owners of newspapers are deeply politically motivated individuals.
What does that mean, though, politically motivated? I mean, they're not members necessarily of a political party, but they may just have views. What do you mean by politically motivated?
I'm not a member of a political party, but I don't think anyone would say that I'm not exceptionally politically motivated. They have an idea of how they want the world to be. And again, they can be responsive to other things going on in the environment. I mean, you guys must have read that incredible profile of the Murdoch family, which popped up in the Atlantic recently. And it was a wonderful portrait of Rupert Murdoch wanting to force through like a smash and grab, bombastic right-wing movement, but also being forced to respond to changes in his political environment, whether that's Trump or something that his audiences want. It's a kind of
Ash, that's thing. An owner. That's not necessarily an editor.
Oh yeah, but
I'm just bridling slightly at your characterization of top journalists making decision makers as being highly politically motivated.
I'm saying very often, but I think if you take somebody like Harry Cole, he's
the political editor of the Sun.
Absolutely a deeply politically motivated individual. And if he claims that he's not, I mean, that's just,
Anyway, I'm pushing back on the notion that all this big decision makers in media are political activists.
Not all of them, but surely a lot of them are.
Very often.
Yeah.
Oh.
Very, very often. There's the famous saying, came from von Clausewitz and then was tweaked by Foucault. So as politics is war by other means, and I kind of think that media is politics by other means. It is a site of political contestation.
Talk about the period of Jeremy Corbyn, because I think you feel more warmly to Jeremy Corbyn than many people in journalism. I mean, the reaction to Jeremy Corbyn was visceral, wasn't it? What was going on there?
I mean, I interview an anonymized lobby hack whose name I couldn't share because he doesn't want to lose his job and he wants to be able to get a promotion one day. But one of the things that he said is that for the lobby, there was a common sense position. And this was right from the start of 2015, which is Jeremy Corbyn is useless. He's never going to be prime minister. All his supporters are idiots. And that was the starting point in 2015. Very, very little curiosity and certainly, no sense of political affinity, right, particularly within the lobby. And then you had lots of disgruntled, Labour staffers and MPs who are more on, the right of the party, who found themselves on the outs. And so there was no shortage of sources wanting to brief negatively against Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, one such source who was, beloved by, in particular the Observer was Neil Coyle. So Neil Coyle was always a source of anti-Corbyn agita, just relentlessly negative. And then after Corbyn is no longer Labour Party leader, after the 2019 defeat, and Neil Coyle's behaviour towards a journalist called Henry Dyer, is rightly condemned by all for being, racially disparaging, all the same journalists who relied on him as being a source are coming out and saying, oh, everyone knows he should have been out of Westminster years ago. Hang on, he was your guy. He was your guy for stories. And maybe that's also why you weren't that negative about him during those years. And so I think that the principles of lobby journalism, access in return for anonymity, it also breeds a kind of, I think, it's very easy for ideological motivations to come in and warp the story that you're telling. Two, it encourages a kind of herd mentality. You don't want to stray that far from the agreed story. And also, I think, three, it's very difficult for lobby journalists to become curious about something that's new, because if their sources are no longer well placed, then their journalistic career is imperiled. So it breeds a sort of hostility to something new or grassroots or outsider.
Well, I think you make an important point about the lobby, and neither Alan nor I are great fans of the lobby, because it encourages a herd mentality. It's confined, it's select, it's very narrow. And we've talked about this on the program, and in a way, in the hothouse, it sort of exaggerates that reliance between, or dependency between, source and story that you've alluded to. But I just want to go back to Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, everything you've said about Jeremy Corbyn could also be said of the lobby's attitude to Nigel Farage, who arguably in 2014, I took some stick for it, for saying he's probably the most influential politician in Britain. Now, this was before the European elections and well before the Brexit referendum. So aren't we talking really about the media just being very conservative and sticking around the central ground and not being curious? It's no conspiracy. They're just useless.
Well, the thing is that I know that everyone says, oh, if it's cock-up or conspiracy, it's always going to be cock-up. I also think there's a third thing, which is class interests, and that's quite central to this book. The thing about Nigel Farage is that, yes, he's an outsider, and yes, he has a disdain for establishment political institutions and media institutions. But what's different, the difference between him and Jeremy Corbyn is that there is no section of capital that was on Jeremy Corbyn's side. There are some sections of capital that are on Nigel Farage's side. I mean, he's got his billionaire backer. There's GB News. There are people in newspapers who will give him a very, very sympathetic hearing. And he's also somebody he's very good at hacking the media agenda. I mean, you saw this with, the small boats issue. A big part of the wave of media interest came off the back of him going down to, Kent and, on the south coast of the country and taking self-shot videos. He did that, the Mail and the Times follow, and then the BBC follow in behind that.
Well, this is true, but he was talking about immigration, Ash, well before the self-promotion on the internet on small boats. And by the way, in some ways, he was right to be talking about immigration when Britain, breaking with a lot of the other European countries, decided it was fine to have Bulgarians and Romanians did not exercise derogations. And the immigration numbers were far greater than the mainstream political class was saying. There was an issue there.
Look, the thing is that for me, the question with immigration, and we're straying a little bit from the path of the book, but I think that this is important, is that for me, do you look at immigration by itself, cordoned off from other considerations, in which case the answer is always going to be there's too many of them. There's a famous Stuart Hall quote, which is, here's the thing about numbers, once you start counting people, the only answer is there's too many. But if you start looking at immigration with other things in mind, then you go, okay, is the problem immigration, or is the problem immigration and the fact we're not building, and the fact we're not taxing wealth enough, and the fact we sold off all the council housing? I'm not wanting to close down any discussion about what level of immigration is right for this country. I'm really, really not. I'm just saying, why don't we look at it in a context?
Yeah,
why don't we look at it in a context?
Again, I think the media just to round off this little diversion on immigration, the media has cheapened the argument by focusing it on numbers, but implicitly and sometimes explicitly, this notion that somehow, and it's got nothing to do with numbers, it's got with the sense that the border, it's uncontrolled, is an incredibly powerful motivation, an incredible political force. And you've seen that particularly in America and also, frankly, in the run-up to Brexit, arguably one of the most important issues at that time.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, the fact that Brexit came so quickly after that huge 2015, uptick in displaced persons coming into Europe, I think is significant. I mean, that's a big part
from the Middle East and the collapse of in Syria,
because of the collapse of Syria. But there's also something which is important, which is that media has the capacity to warp and distort our perceptions of what's going on around us. So there's an example that I give in the book of the early 2000s. You've got this big asylum seeker moral panic. It's being driven in a big way by the Sun and the news of the world. You've got Tony Blair and David Blunkett feeding into it, and the BNP are making absolute hay. And a Guardian journalist actually goes down to Broxbourne, which is in Hertfordshire, to ask people what they think about asylum seekers, because that was where the BNP were going to pick up some council seats for the first time in the local elections. And people are saying to him, I'm sick of seeing all these asylum seekers. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of seeing them at the post office collecting their gyro. They're everywhere. They're changing Broxbourne for the worst. And then he does a bit of research and he finds out that not a single asylum seeker has been placed in Broxbourne. Not one. So I don't know what it is people were seeing. I don't know what it was people were seeing. But the tenor of media coverage has a profound impact on people's experience of reality in a way which isn't always in line with the material facts on the ground.
Why do you think, Ash, that there have been several attempts, but no one's really successfully created a left-wing media outlet in this country?
God, I thought The Guardian was, redeeming. What are you talking about?
I mean,
maybe I don't.
I can talk about The Guardian's political position, but you know what I mean. That the people,
the Corbynist, the Corbyn Weekly,
people decry, the right wing shock jocks. I mean, it's true in America too, isn't it? That people have said, if we could only have a left wing Joe Rogan, or there only could be a left wing version of the Sun, left wing version of the Daily Mail, and it just doesn't work, does it?
When it comes to left wing Joe Rogan, actually, I think it can work. You see individuals like Hassan Piker, who, is a very, very popular streamer. I mean, he's basically a celebrity. And he's, a socialist. He's a dyed-in-the-wool socialist. And he's speaking to an audience of young men who I think could otherwise be tempted by the alt-right, and does so very well. When it comes to the UK context, I mean, the simple answer is money. The simple answer is money. All right. If you are, like we are at Novara, a bunch of anarchists, communists, socialists, and social democrats, you're not going to find very many billionaires who are like, yeah, here's loads of money to spread your ideology and your worldview. All right. It's not in their class interests to do so. You've got this broader problem that everyone in media is facing of the decline of ad revenue. And, people's desire is to access information for free. So when you implement a paywall, particularly if it's at the earlier stage of your media outlet, that could just completely collapse your audience. So for Novara, we've grown slower than other outlets, but it's been sustainable because we can't spend money until our audience are giving it to us.
How big is Novara now?
So we employ, I guess, about 22, maybe more individuals. We have a paying subscriber base of about 15,000, and we've got many more people who access our content because we don't have a paywall. And part of that is to do with VAT reasons. It would become very, very expensive if we had subscriber-only perks. But while it means that we haven't had those sort of dizzying highs of BuzzFeed or, Vice, who got all this venture capital and then when it left, there was nothing. I think that there is a solidity to our funding model. That means that, yes, the growth is slower, but we can get there year on year.
Is that the answer? I mean, why did the Mirror never achieve the dizzying heights of the Sun? Why did there was a paper you won't remember? You were barely born, called the News on Sunday, that was supposed to be. Lionel will remember that.
Unfortunately, I do.
You might just remember.
It's nearly unreadable. But anyway, there we are.
It lasted about 3 weeks.
I mean, the Mirror was once the most popular newspaper in this country.
1930s, 40s, 50s.
And then,
so what does
along comes Rupert Murdoch, and he completely transforms the newspaper environment in this country. I mean, he understood that if you tacked, his political worldview onto a really great sports section and also tabloid gossip and some boobs, you could go miles with that, and and he did. I think that there's also something about, you can't just look at media in isolation. So when the Mirror was very popular, you also had a strong trade union movement. Lots of these organizations had publications of their own. You had a tradition of working class autodidacticism, which is, I think, diminished with the enfeebling of the trade union movement. So you had an information ecology which had more left-wing stuff in it. And so that means it can have a left-wing product like the Mirror succeed. As those things, decline, there are fewer of them. You have an environment which is broadly more hospitable towards right-wing newspapers as well.
Final question from me, Ash. In the last month, we've seen really remarkable things going on in the United States, both in the terms of ownership of newspapers, the behavior of news organizations, the rampant rise of free speech absolutists, the discrediting of DEI as a way of operating in government corporations, the labeling of any kind of moderation on social media as censorship, and a sort of reveling amongst the musky Trumpites that at last we can say what we really think. Do you think that's going to come over here? Do you think in 2 or 3 years' time the same ethos will be in Britain?
I mean, they're certainly trying. I mean, somebody like Paul Marshall has got his, 5-year, 10-year, 15-year plan, and there was recently a right-wing conference, in London, where you had Jordan Peterson and all these people, and individuals who are associated with the so-called like dark enlightenment, who really want to kind of quasi-fascism. They're organising here. They want to bring it here. I think when you're talking about, whether it's Elon Musk with Twitter or Jeff Bezos with the Washington Post, this for me comes back to the question of why ownership is so central to thinking about media. And I know that there are some people who think that all you need is a good billionaire to balance out all the bad ones. I just think that you can't trust exceptionally wealthy oligarchs with media, that when you want that media to have integrity. Elon Musk, with his Twitter takeover, in the first few weeks of this year, was able to, kind of rock British politics by reviving discussion around the grooming gangs, just because he started tweeting about it and just because the algorithm boosts those posts. So ownership, what's going on in the information environment is hugely important, and I think connects right back to this landlord model of the economy, these sort of feudal kings who are just buying up more and more infrastructure, whether that's physical infrastructure or information infrastructure. You mentioned something about DEI, and I think that this is a question that I have. It's not something I have an answer to, but because Target announced that they were rolling back their DEI measures, there are people who said we're going to have a boycott of Target, and then because Costco said that they were going to keep some of their DEI measures, Reverend Al Sharpton led what's called a buy-in at Costco. So sort of saying we're going to shop here as a reward because you're keeping DEI. Now, at that time, Costco was in a labour dispute with the Teamsters Union, which has got something like 18,000 members. And this, I think, shows the difficulties for progressives. Do you want to align with a sort of corporate liberal DEI culture? Well, what's happening at the executive level is what matters. Or do you say that, well, it doesn't matter if you celebrate Pride Month or not, really. How you treat your workers is the central question for us. And I think that this is going to be a stickier issue for the left to navigate as those sort of gains of liberal identity politics get rolled back. What do? Do you defend liberal identity politics, or do you try and strike out for a different kind of left-wing populism?
Well, Ash, again, congratulations on the book. I wondered about the subtitle, with whether it should be Adventures in the Culture Wars, given there are so many all over the place, but that's just an editor's eye. You said at the beginning that politics has collapsed into media, but I wonder in your case whether media is going to collapse into politics and you're going to be a politician in the next 5 years.
I think this country has got enough problems without me entering the fray. I think that, one, I don't think journalists always make the best strategists. And I think that we can often mistake the people who we're speaking to and in touch with for the rest of the country. And I've certainly made that mistake more times than I care to admit. Two, the idea of being in Parliament with all those awful people makes me want to boil my own head. I just don't think that I want to do it. And three, when the inevitable media stories come out of, how I misspent my youth, I'm not going to be able to pretend to be ashamed of it. I'll be like, yeah, it was a lot of fun. I don't do it anymore because my knees are bad.
Well, the biggest and most important lesson in politics is you got to own it, which you just did. So watch this space. Thank you very much, Ash, for coming on Media Confidential.
Thank you so much for having me.
This interview was from the latest episode of Media Confidential, a podcast brought to you by Prospect Magazine. To listen to the full episode, click on the link below. And if you want full access to Prospect Magazine, go to prospectmagazine.co.uk.